Welcome to the Five Pastime Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up on this episode, Mark Yoshikawa, editor of Reminiscence, the new film on HBO Max starring Hugh Jackman and Rebecca Ferguson. We were discussing Hirokazu Kore-eda's afterlife and Kore-eda's career. Mark is one of the handful of people in my career I would consider mentor-ish, and as you'll hear in this conversation, just a lovely person to talk to and a laid back, calming, but smart presence, especially a great one to talk film. So I'm glad he's on to talk this. But first up, what I watched this week. Had mostly mainstreamish views this week. I did my drive-in double feature and saw The Two Candymen. The DaCosta's for new one that just came out last week first, which was pretty solid. And then I have realized I've never seen the original. I thought maybe I'd seen it at some point and forgotten chunks of it at a sleepover as a kid, but no, I hadn't. And two things stuck out. It's written and directed by Bernard Rose, who frequent guest host Ted Haycraft was telling me has an interesting career, long storied career. And one of the first things that sticks out about Candyman of the 1992 version, which I'd never seen the movie, but I've heard its score, because its score is done by Philip Glass. So you have a slasher-ish movie, progressive as it might be, higher end than other stuff at the time, with a score by Philip Glass. Just omnipresent organs. The other notable thing, which was odd why I didn't see it at the time, was I once called myself a Clive Barker kid, but I had read my share of Books of Blood short stories. So Clive Barker's presence is in that. And I don't think Clive Barker's presence is in the new film at all. Continuing with this mainstreamy viewing this week, and stuff I just should have seen a long time ago, Jaws 2, which then just prompted me to rewatch Jaws for the 50 billionth time. And it's just, they're fun to watch back and forth just because I couldn't go down that route of the infinite Jaws sequels. I've never seen them, but just compare and contrast a perfect movie versus the inability to recreate the perfect movie, even with a lot of the same elements involved. And it's fun to watch as a case study. Maybe not entertaining as a movie, but case study works. But last mainstreamish view of the week, Shang-Chi. I have the last few MCU stuff has not been working strongly for me, so this was a very pleasant surprise. Again, Ted Haycraft and I were watching it together, and he, unbeknownst, said the right thing right before, where we're talking karate movies. He was talking about how his dad never really got into them, and one of the selling points to a good karate movie for him, a good kung fu movie, is treating action sequences like musical numbers, where people need to express emotions they can't express in reality. And sure enough, very, very shortly into the movie, there's one of the first big fight sequences it slowly reveals itself is a pretty lovely courtship. And the movie had a lot of those pleasant surprises. It grew on me a lot too. So much like a lot of other MCU stuff, it's a genre blender in a very vanilla-ish way, but it does the trick. Everyone complains about the Marvel movies all looking alike, kind of how to make movies the MCU way, but and also my unfamiliarity with a lot of kung fu movies. Maybe I just was an easy mark, but I enjoyed it. So anyway, this is a long one, so let's get on with it with Mark Yoshikawa. The other thing that was nice about watching this was I was thinking how, like, of everybody I know, you're the one that has the best VFX chops now. Like, just like, I don't know how the hell you cut those scenes in the when they didn't film on that stage whenever they would do the memory recreation, right? Did they do? I assume if not, they did some motion cameras, and then you had to. Do you do picture in picture with that whenever you're like first putting it in and doing your cuts, or?
It was shot. The intention was to shoot it on the set, and they did a lot of it. Actually projected on the set, and they set up this incredible system where essentially, at concerts how they project images onto a screen, and Well, that you can see through. That you can see sometimes you can see the artist behind them.
Okay, yeah.
Basically, kind of a gauze that they set that up on the stage. So it was a real set that had projection abilities. And what we would do is Lisa originally she asked me when we came on or when I came on, she said, I'm gonna need you on set. And I've been on location a lot, but like this was like on set. It's like because our cutting rooms were down it was down the hall from the
Oh
stage.
shit.
And so what ended up happening was I would end up cutting the scenes, those machine scenes a few times because they would go out and shoot it on in a park or whatever. Let's say the first reminiscence of that guy in the wheelchair, his old army vet, and they would shoot it from three different angles, three different cameras, usually,
Okay.
and then I would have to cut together something pre-cutted essentially to match the three angles that they were going to shoot on the stage where the machine was.
So you had to choose performance pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah, and so there was a lot of so I would pre-cut it first, and then they would come to the cutting room. We would choose sort of how pre-plan maybe the angles that would be shot. Not exactly, it was all done in coverage. But then to create the illusion that yeah, he was walking around in the three dimensions. And they also did this um, thing where they used game technology, some of that 3D game
Like the
technology where
Mandalorian stuff.
yeah, sort of like that. Yeah, where the background kind of shifts in relation to where the camera
Oh,
angle
right.
is.
Okay. Not
And
exactly, but the move around.
yeah, a little bit. It was sort of like meant in that sense, but instead of being around you, obviously, it's in front of you. And so, like
Like a
the
front
camera,
projection version of it.
yeah, I mean, I think it was being projected from the ceiling, and then the camera would have these sensors on it, so that it would know that if you were, so the camera operator and the dolly guys were free to move however they wanted and look around, but the image on the actual screen would shift in relation to make it look like it was um, I don't know how it all
No,
worked, but
no, it's
there
it's
were these guys
how
in the back.
everything turns into a hologram. Like it's kind of.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, that seems like the way you're going to a hologram direction. Like it makes sense.
Yeah. Um, but what ended up happening was, of course, we ended up doing a lot of it in post, as far as picking the, adjusting shots and adjusting timing and coverage. And so a lot of it, because we did the pre-planning, it made it a lot easier to get the images in the right angles and make it feel like it was really in three dimensions on the stage. But as everything, we would always adjust and tweak afterwards, and what he was actually looking at. But when he was on the set, Hugh or Tandy or whoever was there had something to look at, and so they could be reacting to something on the stage with the correct
Oh,
timing.
okay. Interesting. What were the movies you guys were talking about in the editing room? I mean, I think I've read some mentions of some neo noirs and Hitchcock, Rebecca, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there was, we didn't really talk specifically. I mean, we did talk a lot about what some of the conventions of the noir films, not in specifics, but like how to use the voiceover and how to use the music and maybe,
Okay.
but it quickly turned into, especially from the Westworld brains of theirs, much more of the nonlinear editing. Uh, Tricks and such. So, but it was nice that it was one of her intentions from right from the beginning. I know when Lisa was pitching it was she didn't want it to be Blade Runner. She didn't want it to be, even though it was going to be compared invariably to all those films. But
To
like,
his credit, it
she
does
didn't
not
want it to.
feel like Blade Runner. Like the coolest that like you I kind of thought Waterworld at occasional spots, but like
Mm,
in an obvious, very obvious way.
hmm.
Like, and that's Waterworld's not known as prototypical neo noir. So
No, no, no. But as far as narrative, yeah, no, the whole Sam Spade, kind of, um, you know, uh, Humphrey Bogart type, um, Raymond Chandler esque kind of feel of Chinatown ish framework was always there. We had those references, um, but the nonlinear part of it. One thing that really attracted me to it was the nonlinear. I've always loved nonlinear storytelling, and this actually had it all baked in. Whereas normally it would have just been a flashback. Somebody would be sitting there, and then you would remember back to an earlier time. But because of the mechanics of the machine and of the actual movie, there was an actual physical device that they get in, and you go back in time. And so
the first reveal, especially like the first reveal where like you feel like you've just been watching a very basic, uneventful sci-fi movie, and then suddenly the memory device comes in to play.
Right, and then you realize she's been gone for like 4 months or whatever it might be. Yeah, so that was a nice little twist in that, a good use of it. But it did present certain challenges because you couldn't just move around scenes as flashbacks, because we were trying to stick to certain rules about why he would go into the tank and whose perspective it would actually be following, or the memory would be linked to. So, like, for example, we needed to try to bolster their romantic relationship a little bit more earlier in the film. So there's a scene where they're in the park and they've kind of gone away on this little tryst in this beautiful setting. And that used to be much later in the film, but we wanted to move that much earlier because it was a very romantic scene, a beautiful scene, and very different than the rest of the,
it's like an Everglades thing where they sneak away to some park that's above water.
Exactly. It's like the dry lands. It's supposed to be in the, what do they call it? The barren country, where like kind of the rich people, where they walled off a section of the world and dammed it off, so all the water was kind of kept out, and that was the dry. And it was so dry that they had to actually use their sprinklers to water their lawns, those kind of things. But it's like, Beverly Hills, Bel Air. As soon as you cross over the 405, and you're in a different world. But it's yeah, and so, but that scene we had to move up earlier, but we had to place it in a memory of him. We couldn't just cut to it saying, oh, earlier in their relationship, we had to have a device that had him go back and remember that specifically. And so, there were a lot of scenes of him going in and coming out of the tank. And so we just kind of had to jostle those around. So it was different. It presented its own challenge for reordering of scenes because, we were trying to be very faithful to the rules we set up. And also where his voiceover came in, because his whole voice prompt, the whole, you're going on a journey and just follow my voice and all of that. Once we established the idea that he had those little memory stick cards that he would go back and kind of replay. In that case, he was replaying his own voice to lead him back on that journey.
Okay.
We had to.
This goes back to your experience with voiceover and voiceover rules.
Exactly, voiceover rules.
I did have one VFX question. How did you guys do the water rising effect? Because it didn't look like CGI water. It looked like, at best, like, I don't know. Like, I just had no clue how you guys did that. Like, it didn't look like model work. It looked like maybe you rose some lines digitally. I have no clue.
You mean just like overall throughout?
Yeah,
throughout
overall.
I mean, I think, it was a great VFX supervisor. This guy, Bruce Jones, was the VFX supervisor, and he and Paul Cameron, the DP, had planned out a lot of the shots where a lot of it was practical. All the things whenever any of the actors are walking through water, obviously, are kind of set in, there were 3 distinct areas.
It would always be your wide shots, because obviously, like your city shots, there was a little layer of water that you would walk through, and that's made sense.
Right. Yeah, no, the wide shots were mainly CG. I'd say they were mainly CG.
That is CG water.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
mainly.
Wow.
Like, I mean, obviously, like, say that big opening shot, that flyover in shot, that's Miami.
Yeah, that one makes sense. But like, there were so many casual shots. Like, and even then, like, I think it was the train sequence. Like, you tell one shot where it's like, oh, I see one shot in the middle that does look a little VFX-y, but everything else is like, that looks like you guys just combined 2 or 3 practical and recomposited stuff or something in a clever way.
Yeah, no, most of that was CG water. Like when they're up in the Freedom Tower, for that one scene that kind of gets repeated in the film where Bannister and May and he's telling the story about Orpheus up the top. Down below, that's the actual layout and geography of Miami around the Freedom Tower, but it's all CG, and then them walking along those bridges and everything.
That makes sense then.
Yeah, because there was, they did build a bigger water set in the what we called the Sunken Coast, which was, I guess, supposed to be Miami Beach, sort of South Beach area. But there's an old abandoned Six Flags out in New Orleans where we shot almost everything.
Okay.
And they they flooded the main street there, like kind of when you walk in past the turnstiles. And that doubled for a lot of the sets. And so when he's actually having to take the boat up to, say, her nightclub, to the Coconut
in New
Club
Orleans,
in New Orleans, yeah, that was practical of him going up to the set, or to the nightclub. But then when you go widen out, then we just kind of CG'd beyond that. But then they also went to Miami and shot a bunch of drone stuff to eventually, it was interesting because it was a few weeks into maybe a month or two into our cut, but a few weeks into the lockdown of Miami, it was this, we cut everything from my living room, essentially. We were all in our respective houses, but there was this drone operator that said, if you want to go get empty Miami so you don't have to worry, because the whole premise, one of the conceits of the film is that Miami is a ghost town during the day, right? And then it's so hot that everybody does all their business at night. And he goes, if you ever want Miami empty, you have to shoot it now. Because I don't know how long this is going to go on. Of course, now we know it went on for a year. But we all thought that it might just be a window of time that people weren't allowed on the street. And so he went down South Beach and he shot all this drone footage of empty Miami and went through all even the little tram that Bannister takes. That's the real people mover that goes around Miami, and but there was nobody on that. They just it was on limited runs, and maybe some of that was CG tram, but it was interesting. It was like a ghost town. It was just it was so weird. When we were watching, between that and the riots and the civil unrest and everything we were cutting during last summer, when we were cutting it, we were like, oh my God, this movie's going to be out of date by the time it comes out, because everything's happening and the sea levels are rising, and all we needed to do was a contested election, and then
and then just a complete civil war in the country, and then an actual war. The war was in the Middle East in the movie, though, right?
No, that's one thing I noticed. That one thing that throws you off. He talks about the Gulf at one point, and I realized maybe we should have changed that, because it's supposed to be the borders of the United States, people trying to get in. So the war was essentially on the land of people trying to get into. He was Bannister's character was border patrol. When the sea levels rose, a lot of people tried to get to dry land, and they had to set up these barriers, which is where he ended up interrogating people through the Reminiscence machine.
Well, it's the trick of good world building. You have to leave a lot of details on the table especially if you're doing a Chinatown thing. I was listening to someone describe why Chinatown works the other day, and a lot of it was that they give exposition up to the point where you're most interested, and then they'd stop giving it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
That's actually an interesting point. Yeah, there was a lot that we left sort of unexplained. There was a lot more exposition, which is, it was just all the stuff that in the end didn't really move the story forward. And if people wanted to come up with their own stories to surround it, that's fine. But we had to kind of keep more to his search for this woman, which is essentially what the movie follows.
Well, speaking of getting into stories that you can fit in, we're technically talking a specific director and specific movie on this, but I did want to go into, and which is going to have your own interpretive stories onto it. But before we get into Afterlife, I did want to, anytime I have a great editor on, this has to double as the editor's bio episode. So,
sure.
You're from San Jose? Or you're in California, right? You're from California.
Yeah, I grew up in the Bay Area. Yeah, San Jose, right in Cupertino, down the street from Apple.
No shit.
Yeah.
What were So what was your family's uh how much did you watch movies as a kid?
Uh, I watched quite a bit of movies. We went to, they were our favorite movie theaters. As a family, my mom and dad, my dad was an electrical engineer or mechanical engineer, sorry. And my mom was a phlebotomist. Well, worked in the lab at the hospital. So nothing to do with the arts at all.
Were they
But
interested in movies?
sure, they liked movies, but we didn't go out as a family specifically to things other than probably Disney movies. And I made them take me to Star Wars a billion times, I'm sure. And but not as far as their favorite movies. I couldn't even really tell you exactly what they would have been.
There was
But
no movies like your dad made you watch or like he pushed you onto you?
I wouldn't say, no, I don't think so. I don't think it was coming from my parents. It was more from my peer group and my friends and just growing up as a lot of TV type, Saturday afternoon movies and those kind of, I guess that was probably my first introduction to the movies was, obviously on TV, but this is the late 70s. But then when I was old enough to go to the movies by myself and, or be dropped off by my parents, my friends and I would always be going to, there were these great multiplexes that, not multiplexes, single screen, but like, they were called the Centuries in San Jose, Century 21, 22, 23, that had these huge screens. They were like the Cinerama Dome screens. But there were 3 of them. Yeah. They were just torn down last year, a couple years ago, unfortunately. But whatever was playing there. And so, growing up and enjoying the, all the.
Would this be like late 70s, early 80s, whenever they were blowing up all the blockbusters into 70 millimeter, like Spielberg movies and Star Wars in 70 millimeter, or like Poltergeist and things like that?
Not even necessarily 70 millimeter. I bet you they were still 35, but they were big and big spectacles, but they were all those, Star Wars and Raiders and all of those would be big event movies on those big screens. And so we enjoyed, through that time and through the whole 80s, Ghostbusters, Back to the Future type things. We would always be, I think that was more my attraction to the movies was the size and the spectacle. And, I love the stories. And I think the only things my parents, I remember they would take us to drive-ins a lot too. And I remember seeing, one of my first memories was seeing Star Wars. It must have not been my first time because I remember when Darth Vader comes through that first door, knowing who he was, but seeing him on the big screen as we were driving into the theater, and being so upset that we missed the beginning because I'm sure I wanted to see that first opening crawl, but I was just like, we're not, it's already started. I can see it from a distance,
Driving. There's a drive-in near us that I was my big pandemic viewing thing.
Oh, really? Still? Huh. Interesting.
Even now, like there's a part of me that's like I still don't, like it's easier. Okay, we're gonna talk Kore-eda and Afterlife. But like I know you a lot as someone also who was big into, I mean not necessarily doc chops, but like you were always the big behavior natural. When did art house film come into play? When did you start, like how did your taste kind of branch out from there?
It's interesting. I don't even know, first of all, that I really had, but because I still enjoy the big blockbuster stuff. But
that was something you and I also always had in common was as art housey as we would get, you and I still could talk the blockbusters.
Sure. And because I think that does, I mean, going back to my whatever, origin story type stuff, it's like my first getting into movies, you asked, wasn't specifically about movies. It was about, I remember this one behind the scenes of making of Raiders of the Lost Ark. That it was like part of this PBS pledge drive. I remember that we had taped on VHS, and I'd watched it.
I saw a Star Wars one that was similar to that. It would have been later, but
right, yeah. But it was just down and dirty. But they showed how and showed Spielberg behind the scenes, with Lucas talking to Harrison Ford about in the Well of Souls, how they made that. And I had no idea that was a job, you know? And so between that and going to Universal Studios a lot as a kid, actually, you know, now I think about it, that's how my parents, the closest thing that they probably had to understanding once I expressed an interest in making movies was taking me to Universal Studios every summer or so, because that's how I thought you got into movies. Is I remember
because that's how Spielberg got into movies, hanging out at the Universal lot.
Only found that out much later. I should have jumped off that tram. But it's you know, it's funny though, because I remember reading at some point, like my 6th grade, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or it was probably earlier than that. Maybe it was like 4th grade, but it was I wanted to be Universal Studios tram operator because that's the closest thing I knew to movie making, you know? And I was like, that must be the entry level job to getting into making movies.
You could have been in Mallrats.
That's right. But anyway, so my those were my interests, I'm sure, through high school. I'm sure I know I was aware of film history and other, you know, a friend of my mom's for some reason had every Best Picture film on VHS. And so I remember sitting on one summer just watching every single Best Picture film from 1929 Wings you know, and
because not all those are good movies too.
No, I'm sure. And I'm sure I missed some of them or didn't understand some of them, you know, Midnight Cowboy or whatever it might be. But
fair enough.
But you know, finding movies at that stage opened me up also to movies from the 70s that I guess were probably on VHS by then, but movies, you know, like The Graduate or Raging Bull, or I remember The Sting. I really loved The Sting. I don't know if you've watched that recently, but I love that movie.
It's been on my queue to rewatch because I think after Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I was just like, I really want to watch the big star duopolies. Like I want to watch.
Oh yeah.
Big pairing,
Newman kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kids enough times for my lifetime, but still.
Yeah, I mean, like The Sting is like one of those movies that even now I watch, and it's just great filmmaking and great writing, and there's a twist at the end that kind of gets you as an audience member. Even
I do remember being good writing.
Yeah, and great pairing. Yeah, like you said.
Amongst everything else, it was like better writing than. But still, the question remains: when did art house come into the play?
Yeah, and so it was probably when I went to Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, for film school. Then I was introduced to more.
Were you watching mostly American films by this point, or?
Yeah, I would say so. But I'm sure there were several courses I took in every other in international film and then being introduced to, you know, at that point, probably Jim Jarmusch and Jim Wenders and all those kind of things. And I was in school in like the
mid 80s.
I'm not that old. I'm in the early 90s. But
it's the mid 80s movies that was that
we were watching. Yeah. Or that I was kind of more aware of. But then during the early 90s, seeing much more of the independent films that are, I mean, Tarantino obviously being one of them, with Reservoir Dogs coming around that time. But being influenced in, I mean, it's kind of Hollywood art house, but that aspect of it.
Sure. But so you did kind of the apprenticeship editorial route that like seems like it takes fucking forever to do.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a different time, but I came up during when things were still being shot on film, but being ingested into the Avid, telesenate overnight and put into the Avid, and then reconformed onto film, and then negative being cut. So there were bigger crews, and so I was able to, soon after college, get a job down in LA, just on this horrible straight-to-video schlock. There was all kinds of companies I worked for that weren't either kids movies or Skinemax movies or whatever it was. There were all these different aspects to all these small companies. And what the crazy thing was, a lot of them shot on 35 millimeter film. It's a little crazy to think about now. And then it was just going to go straight to video. but yeah, through that, I got an apprenticeship with one of my mentors, my heroes, was Richard Chew.
That's where I was getting to. Richard Chew, editors, one of the 3 editors of Star Wars.
Exactly. And I only knew 3 editors' names when I was a kid. It was Paul Hirsch, Marshall Lucas, and Richard Chew, just because their names kept popping up at the end of Star Wars.
So how did the apprenticeship happen?
So it was just through a friend, just from working at one of those places. I was working at this place called Full Moon, and they the editor that I was working with, Mark Yoshikawa, her friend was Tom Hanks' assistant or something like that. And so they said, "Oh, do you want to work with this new Tom Hanks?" This was at the peak of his, this was like right after Philadelphia. Actually, right after, what was the second one he won for? Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump. It was right after Forrest Gump. And he said he's making a movie. I said, "Oh, that's great."
He was directing a movie at this point.
He was directing a movie, right. And I said, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." But like an idiot, I had like some plans or something. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that because I don't know if it's going to go into my schedule. And then they said, "Oh, but Richard Chew is editing it. Do you want to meet him?" I was like, yeah. I was like just as excited about that as working on the Tom Hanks movie. And then sure enough, met with Richard. He was great, hit it off, and he hired me on. And at that point, I wasn't even an apprentice. I was a kind of a post PA and just getting copies.
Oh, I know that route so well.
Oh yeah. But then, so got on, that was my first, but at that point I had enough union hours working on the other stuff that I was able to move up, I think, there to a second assistant. And yeah, worked with Richard on several films and moved my way up there. But yeah, I was working 10, 12 years as an assistant before I really got my first editing shots.
Was there anything, you had some fun credits as assistant. Like, was there anything memorable from those years that?
Yeah, I was fortunate to. There were 2 mentors I had. Richard Chew, and the other one was Robert Layton, who Bob cut all of Rob Reiner's movies through the 80s, from Spinal Tap on. So he did, but all of those movies that that I just loved.
I think when we first met, I was going through your IMDb. I remember, I think I told you, it was like, I kind of got a soft spot for The Story of Us.
Story of Us. Oh yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. No, by that time it was like, yeah, that was when I started working with Rob and Bob. But yeah, all those earlier movies, the 80s movies, the Harry Met Sally, Princess Brides, Stand By Me, all of those Rob Reiner movies that you kind of like grew up with, even up to, I remember at one point, really, even A Few Good Men, that was one of the times I was really aware, maybe at that point I was more aware of editing. I was like really respected what the editor's job on that film was, creating that courtroom drama. And then, being able to work with him was great. So I worked with him on Story of Us, but then also on the Christopher Guest movies. And so those were a lot of fun. So we worked on Best in Show and A Mighty Wind.
Best in Show in particular, I had a bunch of college friends. It was, Christopher Guest movies are pretty commonly quotable. So yeah.
And it holds up. It's funny. I just watched it on, the funny thing is of films like that, and we even shot on Super 16, I think, because he wanted to make it look like a documentary, like an old, just not the best production value as far as film quality. And so it almost ages better in that sense, because it feels like this thing you just found in the old archives of 16 millimeter film. And even though it has Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara, people you would recognize. But so, yeah, but those were great experiences. It was great experiences, and cut my teeth on, or learning by observing and just being around some great mentors in that sense.
So when did you make the jump?
I'd cut some indie things on my own before that, before the New World, which was basically the first time. What happened was, I was still working with Richard. Richard got hired on for the New World with Malick, and they shot it in Virginia. We cut it. During production, we were in LA. And then we went out to Austin for...
You started cutting in LA?
Yeah, started cutting in LA, just with assembly, just kind of getting things. But again, it was being shot on film. And so we had most of the stuff, we were only... At that point, we weren't really printing all the film. We were only printing select reels, but eventually when we got to Austin, we had a bunch of stuff printed because we were conforming the film. It's crazy to think about now.
That blows my mind.
Yeah, and so I mean, you know how much Terry shoots, and so it was just like we were printing all this stuff. We had this cutting room set up on Bee Caves Road in Austin, and I was in charge. But because I was essentially the first assistant associate editor at that point, Richard was cutting, but I was familiar with all the footage, and so
that's another position I'm familiar with too.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but the thing was getting to Austin, and this is before, and so eventually Hank Corwin and Sarah Klein also came on to cut, and everybody was kind of working on their own parts of the movie. And so Richard was sort of working on the opening, and Sar was given that big battle in the middle, and Hank sort of was given the John Rolfe section at the end of the movie. But then there was this big section in the middle that from the opening till when John Smith kind of meets Pocahontas and then goes back and forth up and down the river. And I just kept assembling.
Which is dramatically kind of the bigger part of the movie.
It's a bit, yeah, exactly. And it's a pretty, it was a pretty sizable chunk. And I kept having them, it started because Terry kept coming to me because I knew where all the bodies were buried, or I knew where all the footage was, essentially. And then, again, it's something you're familiar with. Yeah. But then he kept leaning on me, and so I kept cutting more and more. And Richard was already having me cut big sections.
Were you cutting for Richard before this? How much often were you cutting?
Just a little bit, just scenes here and there, or maybe a little bit of a sequence on, say, like on I Am Sam, or I did this movie First Daughter with Forrest Whitaker.
You were naming so many movies that I projected at one point here in Indiana. So.
Oh, really?
Yep.
How funny.
Yeah.
But but yeah, so I was already sort of cutting. But at this point, it wasn't long after my stint it's long into my stint in Austin where Sar and Hank and Richard were just like, look, Mark's doing just as much cutting as we are. He should be editor. And so they bumped me up. They were really gracious, and they just kind of said, we're going to make this a 4-person editor credit, and then you should be on there. And then, so what ended up happening, of course, they all ended up leaving for other jobs and such. And then I ended up being on for another year after that. And so I realized that was a way of roping me in. And then I was eternally grateful, but I was just like, as Terry and Sarah agreeing just to say, like, we just needed somebody to steer the ship at that point and land the plane, and so you were best qualified, so you just stayed on. And then, I mean, as I know but the New World went through all these different iterations of cuts, and then so that was me and a lot of the other guys, AJ and
you got to tell the story about the premiere. One of my favorite stories of yours is like taking notes at the premiere.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, essentially, we finally got to the premiere of The New World, and it's supposed to be the celebratory time when everybody's saying, oh, what a great job. And, really happy with everything, however they came out. But maybe a day before that, we got the note from New Line that they wanted it to be 15 minutes shorter for when they released theatrically. And so it was the only time in my career that I was at the premiere with a notepad, and I was kind of writing down notes about where to cut things out. And so and then of course afterwards, it's the same thing. Afterwards, everybody having cocktails and hors d'oeuvres and saying,
you're just like tucking your notepad in your pocket.
Exactly.
Like, great movie. We're all happy.
Yeah. And they're like, oh, it's so great. It
don't touch a frame.
Movie. Don't touch a frame. Yeah. And then.
So what happened in between this and Tree of Life? Because, we first met obviously on Tree of Life.
Right. What did happen? I went and worked on this movie, this small movie called American Pastime, which was actually one of my most personal projects. I loved that movie because it's about Japanese American internment camps. And both my parents were interned when they were very young. But it's also about...
Really?
Baseball. Yeah, it's about baseball in the internment camps. And so it was about these two brothers or this family that gets put into the camp, and they, in order to, retain some sense of normalcy in their lives, and this is all true story, or based on true stories, made baseball leagues. and so they, this film had to do with, yeah, it was just a smaller film. But anyway, I did that in between. And then, gosh, that's a good question.
Lime Life comes in between this?
Oh, Lime Life probably comes in there. Yeah, I worked on this film called Bolden up in the Bay Area that took years to come out. But Lime Life, I met Derek Martini during that time, worked on that. Yeah, and then they asked me back for Tree of Life. And again, it was a similar situation where I knew there was going to be multiple editors, and Billy Weber was already out there cutting at the beginning, and I came on during. I guess Daniel was out there during that time, right? Daniel Rosende. Right, because I came out.
Did you get there before Jay Rabinowitz was there, or did he?
I came out right after. I came out right before Jay. So
there was an overlap, wasn't there?
There was an overlap. There was this weird overlap where Billy was supposed to start and then go to Daniel, and then I overlapped with Daniel a little bit. But as I was with Daniel, Jay, was Jay coming on from? Anyway, but Jay came on at that point, and I just remember because I had to show him around, and because he was like, "What's going on here?" Because Jay was just like.
I've described this to you before, but I just remember one of your first days there, I felt like I'd been interning on there for a while, and we had in the back room, which is supposedly the main editor's room, who kept coming and going. Mm-hmm. I had never seen magnetic tape on or magnetic paint on a wall, and then like every scene was supposed to be divided up that way, and we weren't using it. Nothing was used it. And I remember it was a Saturday. Everyone stuck in the room, and up to that point, no one, like, we were interns, we weren't given the guidance on what the hell was going on. But I just remember I was kind of in the room off and on during the day, and you guys were rearranging the scene cards on the wall with the magnetic paint, and that was the day I was like, oh my god, this is a movie. Up until that point, and like, again, like, I'm not showing the grand picture of anything because I'm an intern, but I was just like, oh, I see, this is a movie.
What was I the main editor?
You were leading it. You were leading it.
Oh,
and then suddenly it was just like, oh, there's a narrative direction to it. And you were just like, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? This makes obvious sense that this can come after this. This seems like this connects to that. And then that was the first thing that led to an assembly.
Right. Yeah, I remember that whole thing about the magnetic paint. I mean, which was Chris Roldan's brilliant idea. I'd never seen that before, and I don't know where Chris came out with it.
You'd never seen it before, too. I'm glad, dude. I'm glad. Okay.
Yeah. No, because there'd never been enough scenes to do that. Usually you have a whiteboard or a corkboard, and you put up scene cards. Scene cards are common.
Well, he notoriously had the thing where we were always told that there was, like, most movies that had 200 scenes at most, and he would do a thing where we didn't go all the way to 100 on certain numbers, but we got into the 900s on scenes.
yeah, because like it was almost like the Dewey Decimal System or something, right? Because they would start in the 600s and say, okay, then these
and the unscripted
were like those
had
scenes.
Their own 100 number too.
Right. And so there were a lot. I mean, but there were probably 400, 500, 600 scenes. Who knows? But Chris he said, look, we don't have a board big enough for all of these, so let's paint the walls magnetic and put magnets on the wall.
And to be fair, I was not the intern that had to make those magnetic cards, but I do remember having to do some keyframes for them, but I did not have to do the cards themselves.
But my first thought was, are we going to all get cancer with magnetic paint all around us? I was like, this is a crazy idea. But the funniest story about that whole thing was that I remember at some point it was so hot. This was probably in the summer of Austin,
Sure.
And that stuff, the adhesion or the magnetic power
didn't work,
wears off, and so things would just be falling off the wall just randomly. And so we would half joke, half not really say, Terry, there goes your scene. Too bad, that was our way of editing. We were like, okay, which one was that? Another one bites the dust.
Well, my way of surviving Austin at the time was like I was a night person and I worked nights, so I would come in at night where I guess the scene stuck to the walls.
But as far as organization, or setting up some order to that film, that was key, because I remember vividly now, like, somebody had the thought, it was probably Terry, of setting up diurnally and setting up 7 days.
Oh yeah. No, diurnally came up some of the Kore-eda stuff I was watching this week has a lot of diurnal rhythms. There's been a few things I've been watching diurnal in like a lot of TV shows. Kore-eda has a TV background, and a lot of TV shows do that. Which whenever you're dealing with something that long, a diurnal rhythm just makes sense. And to explain, a diurnal rhythm means you follow the rhythm of morning to night. You follow the rhythm of the sun, so morning light goes to evening light to night.
And it made it, even though the story was so nonlinear in a way, it gave some structure even for us editing to know where to put a scene, just to kind of, if you're tilt a card literally and you say, okay, well, this is a night scene and they're going to bed, you just put that down at the bottom of one of the days, and you can move all the days around.
And we kept finding different structures of like days, or like the structures we ended up with the Buddha sites and everything like that.
Right. And then also he had these dream sequences, right? They were like the giant in the attic, or the
in between the days,
or the plane, but those weren't necessarily always there. I mean, he shot them, but as kind of departures from the story, that, or magical realism, or whatever it might be. But then it just made more sense to put them at night. The one that changed, I remember at the end of, like, say, the second day, there was this big cow montage, or this big cow section.
Oh God, yes.
And I was like,
AJ was on an episode, by the way, and we described this on the episode.
Oh, really? And how it got moved to the front, because we were like, why are we sitting in the middle of watching all these cows right in the middle of the story? And then it obviously made a great, when he was trying to set up the thesis, it fit perfectly there. So, but yeah, it was a different way, as everything was out there, of editing. But, you know. How
long were you on Tree of Life?
I was probably on a good year and a half, I would say, because, after being out in LA, in Austin, we came to post here, and I can't remember if we went back and forth. But
no, we stayed. AJ and
LA.
Keith went back and forth, but we stayed out in LA.
Right. But yeah, I'd say it probably all in a year and a half. Because, I mean, if you probably remember, is we were shooting for the Cannes Festival in 2000. Would have been 10 maybe?
2010, and then we went in 2011.
And then one day they said, oh, you know what? We're going to go next year. And they were like, and knowing the way Terry worked, we're like, does that mean we're working for another year on this? And I remember him meeting with Bill Polat out there, and they, we didn't go on for another year, but we went on for several months.
Well, the cool thing I remember was that he pushed that my problem with the entirety of my career is the greatest experience was the first experience. Everything else is just not lived up to it since then. And so, like, he was always pointing out that, like, because I remember for the longest time we were editing without sound, and I was like, isn't this a component? And forever in Austin, and then when we got to LA, it was almost all sound. And he was like, we need to see this on a stage. We need to see this with big sound, how this is going to do this. And most movies usually, especially at the time, only had a very small sound mix to, like, finalize some of their stuff. And I know he kept referencing the Coens, who had multiple sound mixes at that point. And he kept pushing longer and longer. It's like, I need to see this big. I need to see this with sound after a certain point. And it did make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Seeing it on the big screen, and also getting Terry just to watch large sections of the movie and sit and just concentrate on, what we had in reel by reel was important. And it's a good place to see it because we were right there on the lot. And so we could just run down to the stage and watch it. And I don't know if we would mix for screenings, or I guess we were just doing it ourselves. Oh, that's right.
There was that one. We'd always remix the stems. They put the stems to us, and then we'd recut off those.
But because we were cutting upstairs in that one room. I think that building's been torn down. But, like, we could feed it directly into that theater, and we could watch.
We could screen it. Long wire going into that theater.
yeah, and then screen it and project it into that on the big screen. That was really nice. I haven't really had that much since. That
really?
Because you usually have to output and put it into another format and then get it screened in a proper theater.
That's true. Since I was doing a lot of Vimeo outputs, and I guess we were only doing stereo Vimeo outputs for a long time. What happened after Tree?
Oh, I did a movie called Angriest Man in Brooklyn, and I did a movie called Hick, and that was again with Derek Martini. Another
Wait,
one
isn't
that we
Angriest
saw.
Man in Brooklyn Robin Williams' last movie?
It's one of his last. Yeah, he did another movie called Boulevard after that. But I worked with the director Phil Alden Robinson on that one.
I was bringing up Field of Dreams the other day. How nearly, for me at least, that's some quasi perfect movie for me. Well, one of my favorite memories of you, and also one of the things that like actually was kind of a learning thing from you, was like I would always go into your room and you'd always have a laptop open with the MLB network on at the side, and you'd be watching Giants games. And I adopted it because like I would put like, and I'd have directors come in and see me watching like a Pacers game. And I wasn't watching it. I just had it on at the side because what it was, at least what I took from it, was this idea that the problem when you're really stuck on a scene or you're really putting all your mental energy into a scene, it's so easy to get lost into the termite art of it all and start frame fucking. And you start frame fucking a cut that doesn't need to be there. And so what you need is some just kind of like casual thing to like get you out of that reverie of like some other media, some narrative media that does not matter. And it was like, just have a fucking sporting event on the side that you could check in on occasionally. And you're like, oh yeah, the Pacers are losing. And you cut back and you're like, oh my God, this cut doesn't work. I need to completely redo these like last 3 shots.
That's funny. Don't tell my current directors I do that. Actually, I haven't. The Giants are having a really good season this year, so it's been fun to watch. It's funny too about the whole Field of Dreams thing. Did you watch that whole thing the other day?
I watched half the game. I watched the middle part of the game, and then I saw the highlights of the ending that I missed. And then, but that night I watched Field of Dreams all over again because it was high on iTunes apparently because a lot of people had that.
Oh sure. Oh, it's a great movie. And working with Phil Alden Robinson was really great. I mean, he's an old school, like one of the really knew what he was doing. And though that film may have not turned out like he wanted to, again, it was a great experience. You know, one story I don't know if you've heard this. He's probably related to this other places, but if you really love Field of Dreams, one of the things I remember him telling me about that movie was the ADR at the end. Have you heard this story?
Maybe not.
About playing catch with the dad. So the whole movie, they're testing the movie, and I'm sure I'm butchering his story, but it came right from the horse's mouth. He said, because we were talking about ADR, doing ADR for Angriest Man in Brooklyn, and he said he believes in ADR because they tested Field of Dreams and everybody loved it, and then they hated the ending, and they could not. It got these horrible scores, these really poor scores. And they couldn't figure out why. And they realized it's because they thought they built the movie so much that everybody was going to know that was his dad. And I guess they did know that was his dad that he was playing catch with. He says, "You want to have a catch?" But if you notice off screen, he says dad.
Yeah, or he says, "That's my dad," or something like that.
Well, no, he says, "Hey dad, you want to have a catch?" or something like that. But he used to just say, "You want to have a catch?" And so it's a big moment for Kevin Costner's character, right? Throwing the ball. But the audience left thinking that that dad never knew that was his son. And so it was something for Kevin Costner's character, right? And so then so they went back in ADR and they just had him just say, "Hey dad," and then you cut to Costner and he says,
I know the cut. I know the cut now. Wow.
And then he throws, and then the numbers went through the roof because that's what everybody's waiting for. The entire movie, you're just waiting for that moment, and then your heart fills, and you just feel like that bonding moment, and then it makes that. But if he didn't say, "Hey, Dad," and he just says, "You want to have a catch," it means something to the character of Costner. But then you realize it was nothing.
Because the dad doesn't play it as like he knows that it's his son.
No, but. He doesn't play it, but because
once the ADR is there, you get that vibe that he does know it's his son.
And he's downplaying it or whatever it is, and then he's playing catch with his son. But if you didn't have that, you would be like, "What?" So emotionally, like, stymied.
There's always those tiny things you just can't calibrate of like, you need to see it in front of an audience. Like
Yeah.
the other big thing that I learned a lot from you, that wasn't just from you, it was from that entire room, but I like to think it was just from you, was the calibration of an audience. It was like how to read a room. Because I think I've told you the story. We had a screening, and we had a pretty high profile viewer on there, and they were giving us editing notes, and they were saying like, oh man, the boys are so rambunctious and it's beautiful. And when I'm thinking of the boys and how rambunctious they are, I'm just thinking of all this energy that's there. And I started thinking of the dinosaurs. And I was just like, why can't you cut to the dinosaurs at that point?
Oh my God.
Like, well, because that's exactly what I'm thinking right there. Why don't you make the connection? And we ended the screening. You did not say a word. And we ended the screening, and we're going through our notes on what everyone said. And I casually mentioned like, oh, did you catch that note about why we should maybe intercut the dinosaurs? And you're just like, well, she asked it to be intercut, right? That's how I know it's working, because she wanted it. We're not giving it to her, but she wanted it, and she made that connection. We don't have to do the shot to cut it in there. It's already there.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. And plus,
but it was the brilliance. The thing I took from that was just don't lead the witness whenever you're doing editorial. Like, just like sit back, just let the audience say what they thought of it, and then you got to take your notes from that.
Yeah, no, it's always important to see it in front of an audience, or at least to not lead your witness when you're asking what they thought of a movie.
Because I was just thinking about this today. Like, I've been in rooms where directors have like told audience members like, you don't understand my movie. This is exactly what that one scene, and there was information in that scene that made it clear of what this confusion you're having. Oh no, it's in that movie. And the audience member was like, oh, okay. And they just went home.
I worked on a movie where the director got in an arguing match with one of the people in the audience after. There was a Q&A. It was just a friends and family Q&A, but there was this whole thing that went down, and I was like, this is not good.
It was a friends and family. To be fair, it was a friends and family, the one, but I'm thinking of. But Mockingjay would have come after that, or?
Yeah, so Mockingjay, after Angriest Man in Brooklyn, I got Mockingjay from an old friend, colleague of mine, Alan Bell, had been working with Francis Lawrence on his last couple movies, Water for Elephants and Catching Fire, and he wanted, they knew that the Mockingjay movies, they were going to shoot back to back or all at the same time, and then do part 1 and part 2, and they were going to need more help. And so he called me in for an interview, and this is where Francis Lawrence was a fan of Terry's, and I vouched for, by a couple people that he trusted, and then got the job. So that was a big budget.
How long was
movie.
that then?
Completely opposite of Tree of Life, and so it was kind of strange to jump from one to the other. But I was probably on that for a year, because we shot in Atlanta for like 6 months, and then
you were in Atlanta during that 6 months?
Yeah, I was in Atlanta. I would drive out to set. Alan would have this trailer set up, kind of a mobile editing stage. So Alan would always be there cutting on set, and I would be back in the cutting room in Atlanta, working on other scenes. And then I would drive out to lunch wherever they were, have dailies with Francis and Alan and a lot of the crew. It was almost like old school days where you would kind of watch dailies every day and then kind of get the main notes from the director. And then I would go back and drove a lot around Georgia during that period. But and then quickly they were releasing the Hunger Games every Thanksgiving during that time. So Mockingjay 1 came out, and then I stayed on through about half of post on Mockingjay 2, and then Alan finished it.
I remember I was on my first completely solo movie. Like, I did one movie where I worked with a director who kind of wanted to edit with me, but by my solo one, and I was working in the South near Atlanta, and I remember calling you when I had one, like a first panic or something like that, and one of our mutual friends coined this phrase, but it stuck with me. was WWMYD, which was what would Mark Yoshikawa would do. And it was a lot of it really was okay. Back in the day, back in the Tree of Life days, like we would always go out, and a lot of the interns would go out, and I hope I'm not revealing too much, but like we would assess the people we were working with, all the big people we were working with. And I remember your assessment was like we had different measurements. So there was like chops. There was basic chops, the way to make a scene interesting. There was story sense. And then there was a thing that we kind of knew about, but most of us were too young to understand, but was how to make a director happy. You were the only person that scored high on all three, basically. And I remember nice, also just like, and I've done this shtick for you. My impression of you. You remember my impression from the Tree of the To the Wonder days, where it was basically you would be like thrown some random scene, usually something I cut that you were just like, okay, how do I get this into the movie? Like, if this is what the hell did I just watch? You would always be like standing there, and then you'd kind of like slowly back your way into a wall and just lean against the wall, and then rub your hands through your hair and just sigh, and then you'd come up with an explanation like, okay, I can see how that can work.
That sounds familiar. That must be a calling card, because I think because on Reminiscence, the director's assistant was doing an impersonation of me, and it was something very similar. So probably things haven't.
You have a very calming presence, and you could take crazy, and you're just like, don't dismiss this. There's something here. It was always like there's something to be gained from even the most bad shit to come at you. You would always find something to like, whether it's a positive or a way that they get, like, or from an editor's mind, like, this is how we can integrate this.
Right. Yeah, no, that's what I appreciated about, especially during those days of Malick, and what I have brought along to me on things that are very un-Malick-like, but never dismissing anything, wherever it comes from, any ideas. And that's one thing that I really appreciated about all the work that, you know, everybody did out there, but especially during Tree, you know, with the, you know, between Chris and AJ and Keith and everybody kind of coming together, and you know, Julia and Ellsberg, all these people that
the real murderers row.
Yeah, but you couldn't be precious about things, and I never had been before that, but even less so now, you know, as far as wanting to take ownership over ideas, you know, that kind of thing. It kind of had to be shared. And that's part of what, I learned that from my mentors, but it's also just kind of everybody's trying to help make the film better, and everybody has their own perspectives. And so, but at a certain point, you do have to be the gatekeeper. And I know that's what Terry and Sarah would always try to get me to do, is just say, look, you got to make sure if it gets through the door, this is going to fit in the movie somehow. And you know, whether it did or not is up to other people's perspective. But that's a lot of what editing is. I mean, half of editing is, and I learned this from Richard, half the editing is running the room and being the gatekeeper, and being the politician, and being the therapist, and all.
Is that the reading the room, or is that like reading the director, what they really want, or it's
reading the director, but also reading like notes that come in from other people that are, you know, producers, writers, people that have their own vested interest, or even preview audiences or whatever it might be, but understanding what maybe the note is behind the note, you know, that whole thing.
The note behind the note, that was a big, like, there was also this vibe I got from you that like even the dumbest note you were getting like had a kernel of truth behind it. Like it just how someone describes their note is not the note, but the emotion behind the note. The note behind the note.
Yeah, there's probably something to it, as long as unless they just didn't get it at all, or you know, it's not their type of film. It's just like on Tree, you know, obviously a lot of people, it was very divisive, and so people just didn't like it, and that's fine. It's like, you know, it's like some people just didn't get it, but a lot of people obviously very much love it, and I'm one of those people.
Hirokazu Kore-eda's Afterlife. When did you first see it?
It was really, you made me think about it now that I pick this movie because
What is your memory? What was the great memory when you
my
first saw it?
my favorite memory that I would live forever in eternity, though that's probably not far off, is in 1998, I guess when it came out, I was recently moved to LA. I came down here in the mid 90s, and I went to a film at the Los Angeles Asian American Film Festival. I guess it's called Asian Pacific Film Festival now, in Little Tokyo. And I don't know what intrigued me about the premise of the movie. It was probably just the
Well, it's an amazing premise. It is such an amazing premise.
It's just that kind of high, what do they call it? High concept, kind of that one idea
Right.
of what would you, if you could pick one memory to live the rest of your life in, what would it be?
Yeah.
So I went to the screening downtown and was blown away. I mean, it was exactly the kind of mood for it. I was kind of prepared for, I knew it was going to be more of a thinker or more of a talker, but it grabbed me obviously from those first 10, 15 minutes when you're kind of the style of it and the premise. And so,
were you lucky enough to have seen anything of his before this, or was this?
No, I just kind of walked in fresh, and I think it was probably one of those things that was on a slate in a catalog.
Well, it's his second movie too, so even you seen it at a what would probably been an early festival screening in America, like that's.
Yeah,
LA.
exactly. Yeah, and his first one, Maparosi, I'd never seen. I still haven't seen actually, and I just realized it's on YouTube, so I can watch it. But
so much stuff's on YouTube,
and so is Afterlife too. I had to kind of read. I'm not.
Is that where you watched it?
So, yeah, and so it was. Well, I have the Blu-ray now, but
because the Blu-ray just came out. Like the Criterion just came out. I mean,
I had the Blu-ray, a Japanese version of it that's subtitled. I don't really speak that much. I don't actually any Japanese. I understand some, but I don't speak Japanese. So there was a subtitled version, fortunately, that was out that I had because I was one of my favorite movies. And to this day, it probably still, when people ask my favorite movies, it's right there at the top, I would say, because, well, going back to that first experience. So I was sitting in that theater and, it just sort of washed over me. And I remember one funny story from it is that, you just watched it recently?
Rewatch it. I'll go into my first viewing too in a bit, but
right around an hour 40 minutes into the movie, there's this cut to black that happens, and now that I'm thinking about it and I know the way films work, it was probably the end of Reel 5, and because it was being projected on a film, and so it cut to black, and then the lights went up, and everybody was kind of sitting there. People were clapping. People didn't know the movie, and it could have been an end of a movie, I guess.
I don't know if you remember this, like back when we were cutting together, I used to make a big deal about like, if you feel we're near the ending of a movie, don't have black frames in like the last 20 minutes of a movie.
Right. Well, that's exactly what this was. Like 20 minutes before the end of the movie, there's a black and it holds on it for a while. And I think it was the end of the reel. So the projectionist just assumed it was the end of the movie and brought the lights up. And then Kore-eda comes out on stage, and because he'd been there to present it, and he's had to tell the projectionist.
Was he like waving his arms, just like bring the lights down?
Yeah, and he didn't really speak a lot of English, or any English maybe, and he had to. But he explained to somebody, and then so everybody said, "Oh, I'm sorry, the movie isn't over. There's still one more reel." And I mean, and thank God, because the last reel is great when they're putting together all their memories and filming them and everything. But or maybe I can't remember exactly what the last reel is, but anyway, so he was there at that screening, and so I became a fan of his at that point, and then and then tried to catch as many of the movies as I could of his when they came out since.
Have you seen any of his docs?
No, I haven't.
I feel like ostensibly you have, considering how this hybrid style works, but you hadn't seen any of the pure ones. My first screening, do you remember we used to watch the period when I was like pure intern? I would have everyone over super late when I was still working at the Galaxy Theater while also working on the movie.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And I also had a system set up to where we could play DVDs and Blu-rays on the projector. I watched this at like 1 a.m. in the biggest theater, and because one of the then local filmmakers, Kat Candler out of Austin, had written how much she loved this movie, and I rented it out of probably Vulcan, I think, and watched it from there. My first viewing wasn't. I was not prepped for it. I feel like I thought this was going to be a purely metaphysical movie and not something that was about. Half of it was about filmmaking itself.
Mm.
I was not prepped for the documentary aspect.
And I could also see watching it at 1 a.m. It's not exactly a snappy paced movie, even though there's a lot going on, but it might, I could see it being maybe a little bit deliberately paced, but actually rewatching it, it's not as slow as I thought it was.
No, I mean, and pace is a big issue for me, but this was not that slow. I want to go into this later in a second, but
yeah, but the documentary aspect of it was interesting because I did know, or maybe I found out after the fact, since I went into it totally fresh watching it, that he was a documentary filmmaker, and then it totally made sense in all of those interviews at the beginning. And it's unlike a lot of his other movies since. I mean, first of all, because it is based in this, magical realist world, or kind of this in between, like kind of a parable kind of idea, and not set in the real world.
Is there any other talking head stuff in any of his other movies, or this is it?
There's a little bit in a movie called I Wish, I remember, where the kids are talking about their wishes and what they would wish to happen if they could have any wish in the world. And that had the same feeling as a lot of these interviews where they were in the afterlife, where it just felt like they were sat down, and it's almost like a casting call. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what they did. If they had a casting call, they asked everybody that question: what memory would you live the rest of your life in?
That's how
and then they kind of cast those people beyond there. So that did you see this movie this last year? This documentary called, it was about the old folks home where the mole agent. Did you see this documentary called the Mole Agent? You should check it out.
No.
It's about there were these reporter abuses going on in this Italian old folks home, and so they needed to get an elderly man or an elderly person to go pose as a somebody that was going to be living there, and then find out if the staff was treating the people right and everything. But it's a really good movie. You should check it out. Yeah, it's called The Mole Agent. But in that one, same thing. They interviewed a lot of people because they were trying to find the right agent to go into this home, and everybody had their own stories, and everybody was talking about their own past. And that's what this one felt like to me, is like they may have interviewed these people, and
they end up with like 21, 22 subjects, I think, but it sounds like they interviewed more to go into the movie.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
But then did they craft their stories after that? You were saying that you read or you were listening to the commentary?
I mean, I looked up some stuff, but I mean, Criterion, did their Criterion job. They came out with a good edition with some good behind the scenes. And, well, the crazier thing is, Kore-eda had TV background, and the original premise for this was supposed to be a TV show.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, something that can go, which makes sense, like, especially doing an episode of the week, but then, like, obviously it has its finite story and a very touching last 20 minutes so of in a feature. But
yeah, but the documentary style, even right from the beginning, the first shots when it's kind of handheld following the people up the stairs, and it sets up this world where it's this in-between world. I don't know if you explained to people what this movie is.
Oh, but shit, I guess I have to do the premise. So it takes place in kind of it's not exactly a purgatory, but it's a kind of an in-between space where 22 people have to figure out, they're being interviewed over. The movie takes place over 7 days, but I guess they initially have 3 days to figure out their most favorite memory, and they're interviewed by souls themselves who have not figured out their own favorite memory. And what happens is this kind of bureaucratic school-like area will then, after these souls have figured out their favorite memory, will then refilm it and show them in a movie theater to the souls as they go off and into eternity and relive their favorite memory for eternity. And there's also an in-between space where all these people who are working it are people who haven't decided their favorite memory. And when I heard the premise, I was really expecting something very metaphysical, very magic realism, and I was not expecting something that was this much about documentary subjects. And Kore-eda, one of the cool things about him, that credit where credit's due, is that he's flat out said, like, I'm not interested as a filmmaker in kind of purging my own inner life. I want to discover other people's inner lives, which is a very great ethos to have as a filmmaker.
Right. Yeah, I think and it is very different from a lot of his other films in that sense. I mean, it's very similar in the sense that it's very sincere and it's very honest, and it is kind of like, and I guess that's from the filmmakers. I mean, the documentary background, but like letting people talk and like have their own lived experiences kind of move forward, and it's not always talking about, there's some great scenes in the movie about, people talking about their favorite. What makes me think about that it was shot documentary style was that a lot of them were talking about their experiences during the war, or their first love,
right,
or their favorite, or their memory of their mother or father, or dancing as a little girl. And
one of the crazier ones is the younger person. Like in the commentary, they talk about this. The younger person was just like, I was on Splash Mountain, and the commentary is like, that's a superficial memory. And in the movie, they were just like, look, 30 other girls picked this, and she has to repick her memory based on that. But a younger person's doesn't know what the hell to pick.
Right. And so that kind of guide says, I've been here 1 year, and you're the 30th person who said Disneyland. You're the 30th young girl, and she ends up picking something much more special. Yeah, and so there's a lot of humor in it too, because I remember, like, there's the older gentleman. Was there
a lot of laughs at your first screening?
I can't remember. I think so, a little bit during the interview.
I would imagine they have to be,
because there's like, those guys are very natural, because they're those guys. I haven't even looked this up. You might even know how many of them were actors and how many were non-actors, because that's one thing where, like, they're talking about. I mean, well, obviously this guy's probably an actor, but the main guy that ends up looking at all the VHS tapes of his life, that he says, they're saying, he's like, I had a very boring life, and I'm very plain. And the guy's like, don't you have a favorite? What about your wife? Did you go on any favorite trips with your wife? And he's like, do I have to pick something like that? that whole idea of, like, and then, or like the guy thinking about all the sexual exploits and everything, but then in the end,
the sexual exploits guy is going to come up multiple times. Did you ever? So wait, have you seen the Criterion or not?
No, I have not. No.
Have you? There was he made Kore-eda made a short film based on the deleted scenes.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah. Well, well, the crazier things I was reading the behind the scenes, like, there's a 5-hour cut of this.
What?
Yeah, and you know how one of the most interesting decisions is made is when they get to the end, and they show the filmmaking of everyone's favorite memory, and then they get everyone in the theater to watch it, and as they watch it, they then move on to eternity, but they never show what they actually shot. They never show like that.
Yes. Right.
In the behind the scenes, they still, or in this extra stuff, they still don't show it, but they have this amazing sequence at the very end of the film of this short where they have a front of the auditorium shot where everyone sits down, gets ready to watch their favorite memory, and it's a full auditorium, and it cuts to black, very similar to that end of Reel 5.
Right.
And then it cuts to a shot of snow, which was I think the Saturday or Sunday thing. And then it comes back and it comes up, and the only person left is the one guy who was the very promiscuous, the guy that had a bunch of sexual stories. He's sitting in the front row, and he's the only person in the auditorium, and he fell asleep. And they're just like, they come up to him and like, you can't fall asleep. You can't just sleep through everyone else's stories. Just get to yours. And he's like, I know, I'm sorry, but I just like stories with the climax and, the hips moving. And he starts telling these sexual stories.
That's funny.
It's a great cut because it's shot to shot, like full auditorium, cut to the snow, then cut back to the auditorium. He's the only person sleeping.
He's just asleep, and he just slept through his. It's so funny. Them sitting in that auditorium. I think that was also a special affinity to me for the movie because it was reminiscent of sitting in film school and watching other people's short films, or like you're always sitting there, you're watching all these other films, and some of them are interesting, some of them really aren't, and some of them
some of them really aren't.
And you're kind of like just kind of watching, but you're being kind to everybody else because everybody else there is a filmmaker too, right? And then you're hoping that they don't have the same feeling toward your film as they do, but in that auditorium in Afterlife, yeah, and all the instructors are sitting in the back row, just sort of like your professor.
The back row, because the only other people there were the back row people who were just like used to the auditorium emptying out or the indifference. You had a really great first reaction to it. What was, going back to this idea that you were always one of those editors who's really attuned to behavior. Like, how much of that was it? Because that seems to be Kore-eda, like throughout his So my watching of this was, I realized when we first started talking about doing this, I realized I'd seen this a long time ago, and then I saw Shoplifters, and that was it. So this weekend I rewatched those, and I watched Nobody Knows, and I watched his quasi-English language, mostly French movie, his most recent feature, The Truth. Those are to this day all I've seen of his.
Yeah, I haven't seen The Truth. I've been meaning to,
but you've pretty much seen most everything else. Though.
Everything else that's almost available. I just realized there are a few that I haven't seen. There's a movie called Distance, and there's a movie called his first.
A ton of them are available on Hulu right now, too.
Yeah, and so a lot of those, but I would highly recommend. There's a couple of those movies. One is Like Father, Like Son, and then
that was on my list. I tried to get that one in.
And there's another one called Still Walking that's very much like Ozu. It's like Tokyo Story. It feels but all of them, because I Wish, and then
I'm glad you mentioned Ozu too, just because supposedly he's defensive against Ozu comparisons, but Ozu is the most obvious one. It's a lot of still frames, a lot of was Ozu the one that had the pillow shots?
Yes.
There's a lot of those in there. Ozu just seems the one I would go to.
Yeah, I know it's hard not to compare, but there's also other, I'm sure, several other influences that are more drawing on real life, acting or experiences, because Nobody Knows, or I'm sure there's a lot of that. I don't know what it is, like that Cassavetes, or that feel.
Well, one of the crazy things about watching The Truth and Nobody Knows right next to each other is The Truth was him doing a lot of big actors, and he would shoot a lot of close-ups, and it seemed like a very TV-ish style where he was just going dialogue, faces. But you do Nobody Knows, and Nobody Knows it's got they shot for over a year in the same apartment, and so many of those shots, besides the fact that you could see the it's Boyhood-esque, where you could see the progression of time, but also there's a lot of oblique angles where he's just he really feeds into this behavioral thing where he's not shooting faces, he's shooting feet, he's shooting these odd angles of hands, or angles where you're I'm not sure what I'm watching, and then some figure comes into the frame that's not a face.
Right. And a lot of that is behavior too. And going back to your original question about behavior, I think that is one thing that I did latch onto, and being probably from his documentary background, but even in those talking head interview parts of Afterlife where they're kind of explaining their story and their favorite memory, or they're trying to work through their memories. It's all behavior. Even though they're talking, their facial expressions, their hand gestures, even their body language.
Well, even the storytelling in that too.
Yeah. And then, so I was keyed into that. And then also in this particular movie, at least parts documentary style, following the guides around their campus or whatever it is. But then it's also mixed with very clear, kind of classically composed and classically covered scenes when the narrative needs to kind of move forward, and the people talking. So I love that mix. And then at the end, then it was this extra bonus where all of a sudden it was about filmmaking. I had no idea, two-thirds the way through the movie, and all of a sudden they start shooting their
They shoot
dreams.
so analog. There's going back to what you were talking about, how the physicality of shooting on 35, even though this movie was shot on 16, like just how physical they are on the shooting. They're just we're in this metaphysical space, but by the way, we have to use cotton to like show how a pilot would fly through clouds.
Right. It felt very film schooly too, which I was, not that far removed from too. So it was very nostalgic in that sense. But I think what I didn't realize, and now looking back on it, and why I still count it as probably my favorite film, is it has that movies as memory theme to it, and it's hard to really pin down exactly because works on so many levels. But
when we first started talking about this, you mentioned we were trying to compare Reminiscence to this, and you were saying like you were talking about this while you're editing that, just because memories were a big part.
Yeah, I mean, the way that Lisa had set up the machine in Reminiscence was a little bit different in the sense that it was a exact replica of what your memory. It was like scientifically based, where when you go in the machine, you would be able to recreate, even if things in your peripheral were half aware to you, then they would be a little fuzzier, but the object of your attention would be the most clearly in focus. But the observer, like somebody like Hugh Jackman's character, could look into the person's dream and see things that they weren't even aware of, just because they were aware of it in some sense because of, when they walk into a room. Like right now, I know to my right is my kitchen, to my left is my backyard, but I don't know exactly what's happening there. And if somebody was there, how much of them isn't my memory, how much I could access just from remembering would be different than what scientifically I would be able to recall.
The one specific thing I was remembering was the 21-year-old in Afterlife, who was making the point that like he was, spoiler alert, he was the one who was like, I have to stick around because he couldn't decide, but he was also the one that was arguing about the impermanence of memory.
Right. Yeah, and how it's all, and again, this goes back to the movies or cinema as memory thing. It's like everything, looking back on, your memory is essentially a story that you tell yourself, right? Because you can't really exactly remember what it is.
I'm glad you brought this up. This is going to come up in a second.
Oh, really? And so the idea that and it's all twisted and depending on how long ago it was, obviously you've made your own stories up about what a memory was. Just like us talking about our days on Tree of Life, it's all different. But but yeah, so that's where Reminiscence differs from Afterlife. But in Afterlife, what intrigued me was the idea that if you were only allowed to choose one specific memory, then how do you choose that, and what would you choose?
Well, I was telling you about that new movie, 9 Lives, that just came out. That seems like so influenced by this, like at least in the premise, even though it's the inverse. Whereas this is about what movie you take to the afterlife. That movie's about souls that have not gone into life yet, trying to justify what they would do to go into life themselves. But it even like overlaps to where the level of like, once you go into life, everyone watches these ethereal like purgatory watches human souls through videotape.
Yeah. Wait, in 9 Lives or in Afterlife?
In both.
No way, really.
But in 9 Lives, the whole thing is like they choose a soul to go through, and they watch their first person point of view through a videotape, or they watch it through video, and they have to periodically tape it. And then they tape it just to learn what it is that makes a soul succeed, and what is the metric which choose which pre-soul is going to then get into a human life at that point and live a life.
Yeah. And in Afterlife, it's that character, that older gentleman that says he had such a boring life, he'd have to jog his memory, and then they play those old VHS tapes, and they got all those VHS tapes piled up. And it's funny too, because this is shot in 1998, so it was still, it was
very video society.
Yeah, it was video, but it was on the cusp of DVD. But it's like, I'm so glad it was still VHS, because there's something very tactile and very like nostalgic about seeing those tapes piled up like that. But then he's watching through his years, and it does turn into a plot device too when they realize when the main guy, the young 21-year-old says,
It
I
ended up in Nine Lives ended up being this weird medium. I don't know. It had a metaphysical vibe of going back and forth between this. The storytelling aspect, not to get into broader philosophical ideas, but one of our old mutual friends from Tree of Life, Julio Quintana, was recently on an episode, and we were talking about philosophies on storytelling, and I brought up Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who, again, I'm going to bring up shit that I'm going to describe that I don't entirely understand.
Sure.
But he has this concept, the idea is like your experiencing self versus your remembering self. And your remembering self is the thing that ends up helping you define your personality, or how you self-define personality. But your experiencing self, we dismiss very casually. And he has these examples in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about the first way he describes it is like if you listen to an opera, say like an 8-hour opera, and you listen to 7 hours of it, and it's masterful and emotional. And then in that last hour, they fuck it up and they started screwing it up. You start saying that was a bad opera just because it had a bad ending and it ruined everything. But that goes against your experiencing self, where 7 out of 8 hours of that was masterful and beautiful to you. But your remembering self tends to apply, from what I'm understanding, what Kahneman was talking about, how storytelling works on us, because it also applies to, like, as film people, we constantly talk about endings. We talk about like great endings, going out on a high note, a movie really seeming like it knows what it's doing, and the remembering self basically just correlates to memory to me. Like, and like the very basis of like why storytelling is a basis of all of human organization comes from memory. And memory is like the first story we tell ourselves of who we are, why we're here, what we're doing. And this movie then goes into the central idea of like, why don't you pick a favorite memory of that? Pick a favorite story of what your life, the point of your life was.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that too, because this device of watching the videotapes, which ostensibly within the framework of the film is the real life, and the same thing with Reminiscence, right, is what really happened versus what your memory and the story you tell yourself is.
The imperfect and plastic memory of it was.
Yeah, and I'm sure you make yourself more of a hero, right, in your memories, and you're not the villain, or you're not the, the dupe or whatever it is. But if you in the memories on the tape, and I'll have to watch 9 Lives, but the idea that you can see yourself for who you really are, and then, I mean, it doesn't really, they don't really dive into that so much on an Afterlife, but that is an interesting idea that I think in the filmmaking analog to it, it's like people, writers, directors wanting to go back and tell their life stories or whatever, or even biopics if you're telling a story about somebody else,
Well, I think you're pointing out something interesting about the level of autobiography in every storyteller, much less someone who has the ability to convince someone to pay for a giant multi-million-dollar project to make their own elements of their own autobiography onto film.
Right. But I do think that, but the idea of even memory of movies as a memory is an interesting idea, even as us looking back on old movies that we liked, right? And is how it shaped our, like, just the first part of this talk about what shaped me and my favorite movies were, it's only in retrospect, like at the time, would I have said that, The Graduate or something is a favorite movie? No, I mean, I probably was just watching it and it's only like later in life when you realize, or you put yourself in this framework of like, oh, what shaped me, or what. Whereas I probably would have been the little girl that liked Splash Mountain, right? I would have said, and it's still,
and what's wrong
Star
with
Wars.
The girl that likes Splash Mountain?
Exactly. I was like, I like Star Wars, so what?
Exactly.
That's what. it let me choose that. But as far as movies representing memory, that's a whole different. Yeah, I've always been fascinated with that. We certainly did a lot of that on Tree of Life and other movies I've worked on.
I mean, it's a key part of Tree, but I mean, really, I'm not talking specifically about that. I'm talking about how this affects like everybody's, like even like giant world building genre stories. Like we have to have like a grounded reference for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the Japanese title for this is Wonderful Life, not Afterlife, which I think I haven't even gotten into the like. This is one of your favorite movies, Mark? I didn't realize.
Yeah, it is. Only it again, framing it in that world of memory versus like actual quality movie. It has a special place in nostalgia for me because I found it at a time when my career was just getting going. And I, and like one of the last images on the film, when the one guy realizes his memory, this is very meta, but like the idea that his memory that he wants to hold on to is that memory of being with those people that were making the film, and he looks up into the camera and then he sees the crew looking back at him and then he disappears because his memory.
I think it's going to be a key image for my Instagram on this episode too.
Oh, nice. But there's a lot of that I imbue into this movie in particular, because I think some of his later movies are definitely better for sure. But like that idea of at least
more masterful and more
and more skilled and more emotional and more. This is kind of working at this one like I said, high concept level, and you're kind of like going with it, and it's kind of fun to watch. And I like the artistry of what he did with the movie. But then there's other movies, like his later movies are much more grounded in obviously reality and much more real and human dynamics but still has all the behavior, still has all the great acting, still has the great story, and the are just better movies altogether. But this one I can always rewatch because it brings me back to that time of watching it the first time, which in itself folds back upon memory of, it's my imagination of what it was. This is going back to what you were saying. It's like of what it was to watch the movie the first time.
Yeah.
And it just, and then, having all the filmmaking aspect of it too.
I've always been fascinated with Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong, just because he was wanting to remake how he felt when he was like 5 years old and watching it for the first time. And he wanted to remake that, how the movie he saw in his head for that. I think this is amazing. It's your favorite movie. Even the second time around, I gotta be honest, I didn't entirely engage with the movie.
Yeah. Well, that's fair.
Well, no. As an editor, I have a bigger philosophical question to ask you. What is your concept of pace when you're in editing? Because for me, it's always about, sometimes you get these very insecure, justifiably so, in the early stages when you're putting a movie together and trying to figure out what the hell it is. Do we go faster? Do we go slower? That's always a big question. Go that. And it goes back to basics you taught me, where it was just like, you have to follow what the audience is telling you they like, which so means basically in its in utero state, you have to show the movie to people and then get a very organic reaction from them, engage that reaction, and then develop the movie from there. And one of the basics I have found for pace at that point is how much people are engaged with the elements of what the movie is presenting. Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, kind of basically an Eastern Western pace mentality, where like some movies just feel slow and some movies feel too fast, but at the same time, like a slow movie that is engaged with an audience member perfectly. Like, there's a great quote whenever Kore-eda was like first figuring out what he wanted to do when he switched from TV to features. He thought he was going to try to have to swing for the fences and try to get a big audience. And this producer who was coming down on him, he tells this interview in the Criterion version. This producer said, like, you need to find the specific audience member, the one audience member that you're making this movie for, and make that for them, and then grow it out from there.
That's interesting. Yeah,
what is pace for you? Is I guess the basic question I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think this goes to the core of how I always view editing in general. Is editing for me is just very instinctual, right? So to me, you always just cut. You stay on a shot for as long as you're interested, and then you cut to the next thing you want to watch. You yourself would want to see. That's all editing is, right? And you have to, you can
but then you do it again and again and again for 16 months. And then you're just like, did I have the same reaction every time I watched it?
Well, yeah, no, it's true. It's true. But as far as the core of editing, you're on this shot, and then either you want to see something else or you don't, or you want to stay on that shot. And then you make the cut. And you just have to hope that your instincts line up with at least some people. Ideally, it lines up with the director, because that's the person as an editor you're usually needing to be on the same page, wavelength with, because if you're not on the same wavelength, then it's going to be a rough road ahead. If you're always picking take 3 and they're always picking take 4, or you're always wanting to hold on a shot and they're always wanting to cut, then it's
going to be a fun journey.
Yeah. And so like with all the directors I've worked with, it's always, you never know too, because you're in the interview process, but when you're in for example, when I was doing Succession, right? When I was doing the pilot on Succession.
We didn't even bring up Succession yet.
But it was so different. But Adam McKay is somebody I've always wanted to work with, right? But I had no idea what his tastes were. I love his movies and I love, his work, but then
sensibilities.
Yeah, sensibilities. But then how do but very early on, he was saying, "Oh, you're making all the choices I would have made," and it just gives you more confidence to keep going on with that, Whereas if you're working with a director,
wait, you're saying you and him were completely in sync whenever you were working?
It seemed like it, yeah. It seemed like, and pilots are different because it's so fast and you're doing such a quick cut. And he was like busy. Right. He was busy writing Vice or something during that time, but it was like there's a certain trust there, right? And so you have to know that your instincts are going to be sort of what they, it's not like a few times, like he would say, "Oh, good, that's exactly where I would have cut," or "That's exactly the take," or "That's the person I wanted to see at that point," or "I'm glad you caught that moment," or whatever it is, and that you kind of have to jive with. The same thing, working with Lisa Joy or Terrence Malick or Francis Lawrence, all these people have their own rhythms, right? And their own, and you have to hope that yours is sort of in the same, taste zone as theirs. And then, so that's the first job as an editor, I think. And then the second job is what you're saying in the audience and seeing and hoping that there's more than one person out there that does have that same vibe and is appreciating that same.
Do you think the job of figuring out the audience stuff is the director's job and not your job? Or
no, it's definitely part of the editor's job. It's also the director's job. Everything. The editor's job is to serve the director, in my opinion. That vision, that they're trying to get across. But at a certain point, you're in the trenches, and it's both of your visions, and you're trying to please the audience the same way. Ideally, you're on the same page with the editor, with the director, as far as what understanding what you think the audience wants or doesn't want. As far as pace goes, sometimes I'm guilty of of knowing my instinct initially, and then just pacing things up like crazy because I do get tired of watching it over and over again sometimes. On the other hand, letting things go long just because I know the director would probably want.
Well, I see. This is again one of those things I think you and I instinctively always had in common, where it was again the high-low, the whole even as arty as things need to be, we still wanted to pace them out. But the one, I guess we can wind this down. One of the last things I want to ask you about was our old boss's philosophy that occasionally came up that really, it came up when I was watching this movie a lot. I still have the framed photo that was given to us, the Wu Wei philosophy.
Well, he gave, okay. Explain to me again what that one is, because there were so many of them.
He defined it to us as to walk without walk. I want to say it was almost walk in a creek without leaving a footprint, but it was a walk without leaving a footprint.
Yeah.
This idea of like one of the things that I do find in Kore-eda's general stuff is just this idea of like, I mean, his music philosophy, like the amount of music he would put into stuff, just like the ornaments, the stain on a shot, the unadorned shot that would linger forever. It was just like in the documentary background that he was really trying not to like sprinkle anything up. And the Wu Wei philosophy, from what I remember, was generally just not to try to fancy anything up, and just to let everything represent what it was supposed to represent, and let the audience meet you more than halfway.
Yeah, no, I think that's the whole avoiding, the filmmaker's hand, not being presenting things.
Avoiding the filmmaker's hand was the other the philosophy. I don't know if that was your phrase or that came up, but I remember that was the one I remember more than anything else.
Yeah, no, that definitely was not mine. But that was something I tried to follow when he wanted to do that. It's like, but the reason I said explain that one is just because there was the whole inshindention, which is the wordless communication, and then there were all these.
I used to get Wu Wei and inshindention confused. In fact, when I was looking this up, I mentally went with inshindention and was like, "That's not what I'm thinking of at
all." But as far as an editing philosophy, it's like something. I mean, I do still apply a lot of that feeling of not making things, like not leaving a footprint, meaning the invisible cut, right? It's like the
invisible cut. Yeah.
It's like because like I was saying, if you're cutting to the things that instinctively you would want to see next, then the audience doesn't even know there was a cut there, right? Because they wanted to see it next. And so that's the magic of the invisible cut in a way. Now there's bold things where you put in, and we did that a lot in what we worked on, where you would just cut to something that would be complete. That's a stream of consciousness cutting that's emanating from the film when you're cutting to something that you never would have thought you would have cut to. Right.
I would argue that's different. A pace thing. That was a pace between the invisible versus the bold in that regard, or how you're defining it.
The pace, because those bold cuts would
pace is not just speed. Pace is like information versus like ebb and flow too.
Oh, right.
It's just
right. Yeah, I mean the natural versus the forced, or like the not necessarily forced in a bad way, but something that's a bold.
The flow versus the authorial voice too, even.
Right, but if the authorial voice is the filmmaker's hand, then that would be something that would be looked down upon in that.
I just always argued that you have to have that occasionally. Like, you have to have one little glimpse of it. You have to have the cut from the bone to the
to the space station,
the nuclear satellite. Yeah.
If nuclear satellite. I mean, it's different. It's different strokes for different directors.
This is a microcosm of 2 years in an editing room.
But it is also the editor's job to shape yourselves to those. I mean, because it's like the filmmaker's hand in not showing intention. That's obviously that's the exact opposite of what I'm doing with Francis Lawrence. Everything he does is intentional, and everything is pre-planned, and it's beautifully done. And so it's done very well, and very well composed, and it's everything. The music is put exactly where it should be, and the angles are exactly what they should be. Not leaving not as much to chance, So that's more of a technical feat. Same thing with Reminiscence. I thought Lisa constructed a world and built a team around that had, was very technically well laid out, and something completely different than what Terry would have done.
Like, I mean, at the end of the day, the thing with the movie for me was that, like, I was not prepared. I was expecting some kind of, like, vaguely way more metaphysical thing and not just, like, treatise on filmmaking. So I guess that was why it took me a second to really get into it.
Right.
But
I think to me, it's not so much a treatise on filmmaking. It all stems from that first idea of what what is memory and what is your favorite memory. To me, the stronger part isn't the last third, isn't them making their memories, or even the plot device of the guy realizing he was part of somebody else's memory. All of those things.
Which, by the way, I should mention that thing has eluded me on 2 viewings. It took me forever to realize, like, I had to read plot synopses to realize that.
Oh, that the guy, because he died in the war, and then
which, to be fair, I am kind of a fucking dunce sometimes on a movie, so let's not hold it against the movie.
Because that actually is sort of an emotional moment when he, to me, not for somebody that didn't get it, obviously, but like it's the idea that he always wanted his purpose, and like he didn't have a memory that he could move on for forever because he felt like he didn't have purpose on life.
Actually, you know what? I do have a weird interpretation I want to ask you about really quick. This is on my second viewing tonight, right before we start recording. So there's the 2 main. Takashi is the main one that has the realization that like he was the beloved of his subject's life, his subject's wife's life, and then like his subject, when he gets a memory, he gets a letter, and he's like, "Thank you for not bringing that up." Blah blah blah. But there was the relationship between the 2 younger counselors is between Takashi and Shiori. Shiori is kind of always shot in this way, like she has a crush on him. And like I've heard some interpretations where they're just annoyed that it's characterized as a crush, which I get that. I totally get that. But first off, on Shiori, do you remember her ever talking about any of her memories?
No, I don't remember.
She has a big sequence where they talk about they try to go. They ask everyone, "What's your first memory?" And then the boss brings up this idea that like, "Oh, you could remember when you were in the womb and you were underwater," and then it cuts to a scene of her going in this bathtub where there's all these bathtubs where the water's up to the edge, and she puts her head underneath there and pours water underneath that, and she holds her nose to try to get a memory and gets nothing. That's the only one I remember. I don't remember anything of her actually remembering anything in the movie. Am I?
No, it's been a while since I remembered specifics, but I think that she did not. I mean, she obviously hadn't picked one, and she makes a reference to people leaving her, and something about, because when the guy decides he has found his memory, she's upset that she's gonna
and she stays.
Yeah, she stays, and
she's the last shot in the movie, right?
Because she doesn't want to forget. No, well, not. I don't know if she's the last shot, but
she's like the last.
That other young punk
second
kid,
penultimate shot, and then the last shot is about.
Maybe. Well, I remember because the next week starts, right, and they get a whole new crowd of people coming in, and then that young kid, the punk kid that didn't want to choose anything, he ends up coming on as a new counselor at the very end.
But he's an assistant. He's like an assistant.
Yeah, I mean, he's like kind of a newbie, so I'm sure they're just showing him the ropes. But he kind of is going to be a new counselor, I guess. But as far as hers, I don't know. Yeah.
My weird ass theory: do you think it's possible she is the wife?
No, I don't think so. I don't know. Maybe. No, she's not. You know why she's not? Because that wife moved on. That wife, they went back and looked at her memory.
But the whole thing about the movie, when you watch it multiple times, you start to realize the rules are very flimsy.
Okay, maybe. I mean,
I guess all filmic rules are flimsy if you want to pretend they're flimsy.
Yeah.
Well, the big opening eye thing to me was they made a big, like, it was in the commentary, they started talking about the rules being flimsy, and one of my first notes was on they had to figure out their memory by sundown on Wednesday, and there's key shots in that sequence that are clearly after sundown. Really? And so you make a point. It's just like there's no rigor to these rules.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I didn't notice that. But you know, it's so funny too.
I just want the internet to do something from this. I don't know.
There is something about how rough, and that doesn't surprise me that there's those little holes. But there is something about the movie that is, and knowing it was early in his career too, that has a sort of film school quality to it as well. Not just the way that they're making the films at the end. That I think holds that special place in my heart because it does feel a little bit like that. Like it's this idea that people had made you think, and it kind of was like was realized in a kind of haphazard way. It still comes together, but it still is not, it's his later films are much more auteurish, filmmakerly. But I think that's also what. But again, bring it all full circle. I think that it's the part of the why I liked it is because of the meta aspect of it, not the filmmaking aspect, but me actually finding it at a point in my life when I was, that could be one of my favorite memories of sitting in that room watching that movie for the first time. Like the feeling of watching that movie.
One of the things I forget, I think it was in the essay. The Criterion had this really cool essay in there from Viet Thanh Nguyen, from the author of The Sympathizer.
Oh yeah,
and there's a lot of good information in there about it. But towards the end of that essay in the Criterion edition, he talks about like the main memory that Kore-eda has. If he had to pick a movie or a memory, it was him watching Kurosawa's Ikiru in college. And he tells a story about like at the end of the movie everyone clapped, and it was one of the first times he'd been in a movie theater where everyone clapped, and he's like, who are we clapping to? There's no one. The filmmakers aren't here. They're not going to hear clapping. So
that's interesting. Wait, that was one of Viet's.
That was his no. He in the essay he found that Kore-eda had said that the Kore-eda that was his favorite movie.
I see.
Favorite memory.
Well, it's what's interesting about that is that Ikiru, that character was also named Watanabe. That is probably who that guy was based on. Like the old, the old bureaucrat that has cancer and is looking for his favorite memory. Looking back on his life.
Ikiru is still my favorite Kurosawa movie too. So, yeah.
And it was funny too is that my sister-in-law is friends with Viet. It happens that I happen to know him just socially, so I'll have to ask him about that. That's funny.
I've been wanting to read the sequel too. So, Mark Yoshikawa, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Please come back.
Thank you, Shane. Anytime. Do it.
Yeah, man.
Do it again. All right.